There are mistakes that can be corrected, lessons learned from failure, wounds that heal with time. And then there are choices so catastrophic, so absolute in their consequence, that they reshape entire civilizations and echo across millions of years, impossible to undo, impossible to forgive. Szarekh, the silent king of the Necrontyr, made such a choice. He saved his species from extinction and condemned them to something infinitely worse. He traded flesh and blood for living metal, but mortality for a mockery of immortality, and souls for an eternity of hollowness. When he finally understood the full weight of what he had done, when he saw clearly the price his people had paid for survival, it was far too late. This is the story of how the Necrons lost their souls, how a king's desperation led to the damnation of billions, and how regret can endure for 60 million years. Long before humanity crawled from the primordial waters of Terra, before the Eldar claimed the stars as their birthright, before even the Old Ones began their work of seeding life across the galaxy, there existed a species called the Necrontyr. They were mortal, flesh and blood, and they lived on a world bathed in the cruel radiation of a dying star. Their sun killed them slowly, relentlessly, flooding their planet with energy that ravaged cells and corrupted genetic material, ensuring that even those lucky enough to survive childhood would rarely see more than a handful of decades before cancer consumed them. The Necrontyr were a civilization born into suffering, their entire existence defined by the shadow of early death, their culture shaped by the knowledge that life was brief and painful and ultimately meaningless. They responded to this curse with defiance. If life was short, they would make it count. If their bodies were weak, they would build monuments that would endure long after flesh had turned to dust. The Necrontyr became master builders, architects of impossible scale, crafting tombs and pyramids and structures designed to outlast the stars themselves. They developed technology in pursuit of the one thing their dying sun denied them: longevity, searching desperately for any means to extend their pitiful lifespans. They became obsessed with death, with legacy, now with the question of what remained when the body failed and the light went out. Despite their short lives, or perhaps because of them, the Necrontyr expanded across the stars, building an empire that stretched across the galaxy. They conquered world after world, driven by a hunger to achieve something, anything, before the cancer claimed them. But expansion brought them into contact with other species, and among those species were the Old Ones, beings of such power and longevity that they seemed to mock everything the Necrontyr suffered. The Old Ones were ancient beyond measure, masters of the webway, wielders of psychic abilities that allowed them to reshape reality with thought alone. They lived for millions of years, their bodies untouched by decay, their minds accumulating wisdom across eons that the Necrontyr could barely comprehend. The Necrontyr looked upon the Old Ones and felt something beyond envy, a hatred born from the fundamental injustice of existence. Why should the Old Ones live forever while the Necrontyr withered and died before reaching their prime? The Necrontyr sent ambassadors, begging the Old Ones to share the secret of their longevity, offering tribute and alliance in exchange for the gift of extended life. The Old Ones refused. Perhaps they saw the Necrontyr as unworthy, or perhaps they understood that the secret of their immortality could not simply be transferred to another species, that it was woven into the very fabric of their being in ways that could not be replicated. Whatever their reasons, the refusal was absolute, and to the Necrontyr, it felt like cruelty, like the universe itself declaring that they were meant to suffer while others thrived. The refusal sparked a war, the war in heaven, a conflict so vast and destructive that it would reshape the galaxy and create wounds in reality that would never fully heal. The Necrontyr threw everything they had against the Old Ones. Their entire civilization mobilized for war, billions of short-lived soldiers dying in battles that their enemies barely noticed. But the Old Ones were too powerful, their mastery of the webway allowing them to strike anywhere and retreat before retaliation, their psychic abilities turning Necrontyr technology against itself. The war was a disaster, the Necrontyr losing battle after battle, their empire crumbling under the weight of an enemy they could not defeat. Szarekh, the Silent King, the supreme ruler of the Necrontyr, watched his people die and understood that conventional warfare would never be enough. The Old Ones could not be beaten through military might alone. The Necrontyr needed something more, needed power that could match or exceed what the Old Ones possessed, and Szarekh was willing to do anything, sacrifice anything, to secure that power. It was in this desperation that the Necrontyr turned to the C'tan, the star gods, entities of pure energy that fed on the light of suns, beings that existed on a level of reality the Necrontyr were only beginning to understand. The C'tan had always existed, drifting through the void, feeding on stellar radiation, yet vast and incomprehensible and entirely indifferent to the material universe and the mortal creatures that inhabited it. But the Necrontyr had developed technology that could give the C'tan something they had never possessed: form, bodies made of living metal that would allow them to interact with the physical world in ways previously impossible. The Necrontyr offered these bodies to the C'tan, forging shells of necrodermis that could contain and focus the star gods' energies, and in return, they asked for help against the Old Ones. The C'tan accepted, not out of any sense of alliance or gratitude, but because embodiment opened new possibilities for feeding, new sensations, new ways of experiencing reality. They took the bodies the Necrontyr offered and found that physical form came with physical appetites. They learned to feed not just on stars, but on life itself, draining the essence from living beings, consuming souls as easily as they had once consumed light. And they were powerful, far more powerful than the Necrontyr had imagined, capable of manipulating the fundamental forces of the universe, bending physics to their will, shattering planets with a thought. With the C'tan as allies, the tide of the war in heaven began to turn. The Necrontyr and their new gods struck back against the Old Ones, winning battles that had previously been unthinkable, pushing the ancient enemy into retreat. But the C'tan demanded payment for their assistance, and that payment was steep. They fed on the Necrontyr, culling populations to sustain themselves, treating their supposed allies as livestock. Szarekh watched his people devoured by the very beings he had empowered, and he understood that the alliance could not continue as it was. The Necrontyr were caught between two enemies, the Old Ones who refused to help them and the C'tan who consumed them. It was in this impossible situation that the C'tan offered a solution, a way to end the Necrontyr's suffering forever, to grant them the immortality they had always craved, to transform them into beings that could stand as equals to the Old Ones. The process was called Biotransference, and the C'tan presented it as a gift, as salvation. The Necrontyr would shed their weak, cancer-ridden flesh and be reborn in bodies of living metal, immortal, immune to disease and age, stronger and more durable than anything made of flesh could ever be. They would become eternal, and in their new forms, they would finally have the power to defeat the Old Ones and claim the galaxy as their own. Szarekh listened to the offer, And in his desperation, in his exhaustion from watching his people suffer and die, he made the choice that would define the next 60 million years. He agreed to the biotransference. He commanded his people to enter the great machines the Satan had built, the furnaces that would strip away their organic forms and transfer their consciousness into bodies of necrodermis. He told them it was salvation, told them they would emerge as gods, told them that the age of suffering was finally ending. And the Necrontyr, trusting their king, trusting that he would not lead them to damnation, obeyed. The biotransference began, and billions of Necrontyr entered the furnaces, lying down in chambers filled with strange energies, closing their eyes as flesh and closing them again as metal. But something was wrong, something that the Satan had not explained, or perhaps had explained and Szarekh had been too desperate to hear. The transfer was not perfect, not complete. The consciousness that emerged in the metal bodies was diminished, hollowed out, stripped of something essential. The Necrontyr had possessed souls, that ineffable spark that made them individuals, that allowed them to feel and dream and create, and the biotransference consumed those souls, feeding them to the Satan as payment for the immortality granted. Szarekh himself underwent the process, and when he awoke in his new body, he understood immediately what had been lost. He could think, could remember, could plan and strategize. But something was missing, a depth of feeling that had once defined his existence. Emotions were muted, distant, like echoes of something that had once been real. Joy was gone. Sorrow was gone. To love and hate and fear and hope, all of it reduced to pale shadows. He was immortal, yes, but he was also hollow, a machine wearing the memory of a person, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late. The biotransference was complete, and the Necrontyr no longer existed. In their place stood the Necrons, immortal warriors of living metal, an army without soul or mercy or hesitation. The majority had been reduced even further than Szarekh, their personalities almost entirely erased, their minds simplified into obedience and function. The common soldiers remembered nothing of their previous lives, had no sense of self beyond the most basic programming. They were weapons, tools, automatons that looked like people but had been stripped of everything that made them people. Only the nobility retained something resembling their former selves, and even they were diminished, their emotions gutted, their memories fragmented. Szarekh looked upon his transformed people and saw the full scope of what he had done. He had saved them from extinction, yes, but he had killed them in the process, replacing living beings with imitations, creating an empire of the dead wearing the faces of those who had trusted him to lead them to something better. The Satan had lied, or rather, they had told a truth so incomplete that it amounted to deception. Immortality had been granted, but the cost had been everything that made immortality worth having. The Necrons would exist forever, but they would exist without purpose, without growth, without the capacity for anything beyond what they had been programmed to do. They were eternal, but they were also finished, frozen in a state of being that could never evolve or change or find meaning. Szarekh's regret was immediate and absolute, but he was a king, and kings do not have the luxury of despair. The war in heaven continued, and now the Necrons fought with a terrible efficiency, their new bodies immune to the weapons that had once slaughtered them, their immortality allowing them to throw themselves into battles that would have been suicidal for flesh and blood. They pushed the old ones back, system by system, world by world, and the C'tan fed on the carnage. Growing stronger with every victory, every genocide, every world burned clean of life. The war raged for millions of years, and the galaxy itself began to break under the strain. The Old Ones, desperate to turn the tide, began creating new species, uplifting primitive races and granting them psychic abilities, hoping to use the warp as a weapon against the soulless Necrons. But this strategy backfired catastrophically. The psychic energies unleashed during the war, feeding nascent entities in the immaterium, creating the first stirrings of what would eventually become the Chaos Gods. The warp, once a relatively calm dimension, began to roil with malevolence, and demons started to claw their way into reality, killing indiscriminately, slaughtering the creations of the Old Ones and attacking the Necrons with equal fury. The galaxy was dying, consumed by a three-way war between the Necrons and C'tan, the Old Ones and their creations, and the entities of the warp that neither side had intended to awaken. Entire regions of space were rendered uninhabitable, stars were extinguished, planets were reduced to lifeless rocks. The war in heaven had become a war against existence itself, and Szarekh understood that if it continued, there would be nothing left to rule, no galaxy to claim, only endless void and ruin. And so he turned his attention to the C'tan, the beings who had promised salvation and delivered damnation, the gods who fed on his people and treated them as slaves despite the alliance. Szarekh began to plan, carefully and quietly, studying the C'tan, learning their weaknesses, developing weapons that could harm beings that seemed invincible. He gathered the other Necron nobles, those who still retained enough of their minds to understand what had been done to them, and he forged a conspiracy, a plan to shatter the gods who had enslaved them. The rebellion began with betrayal, swift and absolute. The Necrons turned on the C'tan in the midst of battle, weapons specifically designed to harm star gods tearing into their forms, reality-warping technology shattering their bodies into fragments. The C'tan, caught completely off guard, fought back with desperate fury, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and one by one they fell, their essences broken into shards, their consciousness fragmented across countless pieces. The Necrons trapped these shards in tesseract labyrinths, prisons of folded space from which even gods could not escape, and they stored them away as weapons, as power sources, as trophies of their victory over those who had claimed to be their masters. But killing gods, even gods as cruel as the C'tan, did not return what had been lost. The Necrons were still hollow, still soulless, still trapped in bodies of metal with no way to reclaim the flesh they had surrendered. Szarekh looked upon the shattered C'tan and felt nothing, no satisfaction, no triumph, only the endless emptiness that was his existence now. The war in heaven ground toward its conclusion, the Old Ones finally defeated, their empire shattered, their species extinct or scattered. The Necrons had won, but the victory was meaningless, because they had lost themselves in the process of achieving it. The galaxy was broken, the warp was a screaming hellscape, and the Necrons themselves were exhausted, their numbers depleted despite their immortality, their infrastructure damaged beyond easy repair. Szarekh made a final decision, one born from the same desperation that had led to the Biotransference, though tempered now by bitter experience. He commanded his people to enter the great tomb complexes that had been built across thousands of worlds, to go into stasis, to sleep for millions of years while the galaxy healed and the warp storms subsided. When they awoke, he told them, perhaps they would find a universe worth ruling. Perhaps they would discover a way to reverse what had been done, to reclaim what they had lost. But Szarekh himself did not sleep, not immediately. Before entering stasis, he destroyed the command protocols that bound the Necron dynasties to his will, shattering the chains of absolute obedience that had held his people in thrall. He did this knowing it would fragment the Necrons when they awoke, that without his unifying command, they would splinter into rival dynasties. But he did it anyway, because he could not bear the weight of their obedience. Chuta could not stand to rule over slaves when he was the one who had enslaved them. It was a gesture of penance, inadequate and far too late. But it was all he had to offer. Then the Silent King left the galaxy entirely, taking a handful of ships and departing into the intergalactic void, self-imposed exile for the crime of damning his species. He wandered the emptiness between galaxies for 60 million years, alone with his regret, unable to sleep because sleep offered no escape from what he had done, unable to die because his body would simply repair itself and awaken again. He thought about the biotransference endlessly, replaying the decision in his mind, searching for the moment when he could have chosen differently, when he could have saved his people without destroying them. He found no answers, only the certainty that the choice he had made was irrevocable and unforgivable. While Szarekh wandered the void, the galaxy changed beyond recognition. The old ones vanished, their legacy scattered. New species emerged, primitive races that evolved in the ruins of the old empires. The Eldar rose to dominance, claiming the stars that the Necrons had once ruled, building an empire of grace and arrogance. Humanity crawled from the mud of Terra and began its long climb toward the stars. The orcs spread like a plague. The Krork creations of the old ones devolved into something brutal and mindless, but terrifyingly effective. And deep beneath the surface of thousands of worlds, the Necrons slept, their tomb complexes silent, their warriors dreaming dreams that were not quite dreams, waiting for the signal to awaken. That signal came slowly, inconsistently, as the mechanisms designed to rouse the Necrons after a set period began to fail or activate prematurely. Some tomb worlds awoke to find themselves under attack, their rest interrupted by younger races who had built cities on the surface, who mined the very rock that held the ancient tombs. Others awoke to find their worlds lifeless, scoured clean by time or catastrophe. And some awoke to malfunctioning systems, their warriors' minds corrupted by millions of years of stasis, their personalities degraded into madness or erased entirely, leaving only the most basic functions. Szarekh, wandering in the intergalactic dark, sensed the awakening through channels that connected him to his people despite the vast distances. He felt tomb worlds coming online, dynasties stirring from their long sleep, and he turned his ships around, beginning the long journey back to the galaxy he had abandoned. But before he could return, he encountered something that changed his understanding of the universe entirely. Something that made even the horror of the biotransference seem small by comparison. He found the Tyranids, a species from beyond the galactic rim, a hive mind of endless hunger that consumed everything in its path, leaving nothing but lifeless rock in its wake. Szarekh watched as the Tyranids devoured entire galaxies in the void between galaxies, stripping them of all biological matter, all life, all potential. He understood immediately that the Tyranids were coming to his galaxy, to the place where his people slept, and that when they arrived, they would consume everything, every species, every world, until nothing remained but the Necrons themselves, immortal and alone in a dead universe. The realization gave Szarekh something he had not felt in millions of years: purpose. The Necrons could not die. could not be consumed by the Tyranids because they had no biological matter to harvest, but everyone else in the galaxy could. And if the Tyranids consumed all life, so the Necrons would exist forever in a galaxy devoid of anything but themselves and the hive mind. An eternity more terrible than anything Szarekh had imagined. He had damned his people to soulless immortality. But now he understood that their fate was tied to the survival of the very species they might have once sought to eradicate. Szarekh returned to the galaxy with new resolve, traveling to tomb worlds that had awakened, speaking to the dynasties that had fragmented in his absence. He no longer commanded absolute obedience. The protocols he had destroyed ensured that. But he still carried authority, still possessed the respect due to the Silent King. He told them of the Tyranid threat, warned them that the galaxy itself was in danger, and urged them to set aside their rivalries and prepare for the coming storm. Some dynasties listened, others ignored him, pursuing their own agendas, reclaiming old territories, waging wars against the younger races for reasons that ranged from ancient grudges to simple territorial acquisition. The Necrons were awakening to a galaxy they did not recognize, a universe filled with species that had never heard of the Necrontyr, that knew nothing of the war in heaven or the price that had been paid for the current shape of reality. To the Imperium of Man, the Necrons were simply another Xenos threat, ancient killing machines to be destroyed without mercy or understanding. To the Eldar, they were a reminder of sins long buried, enemies from a time before the fall, dangerous but also somehow pitiable. To the Orcs, they were just another good fight, metal gits that got back up after you chopped them down. But the Necrons remembered, or at least some of them did. The nobility retained fragments of their past, memories of flesh and blood, of families and dynasties that had meant something before the Biotransference. They looked upon the galaxy and felt echoes of emotions they could no longer fully experience, ghost sensations of loss and regret and anger. Some sought to reclaim their old empire, to rebuild what had been lost, to rule the galaxy as they once had. Others pursued more esoteric goals, collecting artifacts, studying the warp, searching for any possible means to reverse the biotransference and reclaim their stolen souls. Szarekh himself remained focused on the Tyranid threat and working to unite the dynasties, forming alliances with Xeno species he would have once destroyed without hesitation. He negotiated with the Imperium, with Eldar craft worlds, with anyone who might contribute to the defense against the Hive fleets. It was a strange position for the Silent King, the one who had led his people into damnation, now working to save the very enemies his people had fought against. But the alternative was unthinkable, an eternity in a dead galaxy. The Necrons enduring forever with nothing but their regret and the memory of what they had once been. The irony was not lost on him. He had made the Necrons immortal, and now their immortality was a curse that required the survival of mortal species to be bearable. The flesh beings that the Necrontyr had once envied, that they had gone to war to steal the secrets from, were now necessary for the Necrons' continued existence to have any meaning at all. Without life in the galaxy, without the possibility of interaction or purpose beyond mere existence, the Necrons would be truly alone. And loneliness across eternity was a punishment even Sarekh's dulled emotions could comprehend. Some Necrons rejected this logic entirely, pursued their own visions of what the galaxy should be. Imhotep the Stormlord sought to conquer and dominate, to rebuild the Necron Empire through force and terror. Trazyn the Infinite collected relics and specimens, preserving moments of history in his galleries, creating a museum of the galaxy's past, as if he could hold back time itself through careful curation. Awaken the diviner studied the flow of time, seeking to manipulate causality itself, to perhaps undo the biotransference by altering the past. Each had their own response to the fundamental emptiness of their existence. Each sought meaning in their own way. But for Szarekh, meaning could only be found in purpose, and purpose meant protecting what remained of life in the galaxy, even if that life belonged to species that would never understand or appreciate the sacrifice. He continued his work, traveling from tomb world to tomb world, speaking to dynasties, forging alliances, preparing for the war against the Tyranids that he knew was coming. He did this knowing that even if he succeeded, even if the Tyranids were defeated and the galaxy preserved, he would still be hollow, still be soulless, still carry the weight of what he had done to his people. The regret never faded, never diminished with the passage of time. If anything, it grew stronger as the years accumulated, as Szarekh watched the younger races live and die, experiencing the full range of existence that had been stolen from the Necrons. He saw humans love and hate and dream and despair, saw Eldar create beauty and fall to darkness, saw orcs find joy in simple violence, and he envied them all, because even in their suffering, they were alive in a way the Necrons could never be again. There were moments when Szarekh considered simply shutting down, allowing his systems to fail, ending his existence and the burden of memory that came with it. But he could not, because as long as the Necrons existed, as long as his people endured in their diminished state, he bore responsibility for them, for the choice that had damned them. He was the silent king, one, and kings do not have the luxury of escape. And so Szarekh endures, fighting wars he does not care about, forming alliances with beings he cannot truly understand, protecting a galaxy that has forgotten his people ever existed in their original form. He carries regret that spans 60 million years, guilt that has outlasted empires and species, the knowledge that he made a choice that saved his people from one death and delivered them to something infinitely worse. He is immortal, and he will remain immortal, and every day of that eternity is a reminder of the moment when desperation overcame wisdom, when the promise of salvation blinded him to the reality of damnation. The Necrons lost their souls in the furnaces of biotransference, consumed by the Citan as payment for bodies that would never age, never sicken, never die. They gained immortality and lost everything that made immortality worth having. They became eternal, and in their eternity, they are alone, hollow, trapped in forms that can feel neither joy nor sorrow in any meaningful way. They are the galaxy's oldest mistake, a warning written in living metal about the price of desperation and the danger of trusting gods who hunger. Szarekh, the silent king, knows this truth more completely than any other being in existence. He made the choice, gave the order, watched his people march into the furnaces believing they would emerge as something greater. He heard their screams as the process began, felt the moment when billions of souls were consumed, and when silence finally fell, he understood that he had killed his entire species to save them from death. The irony is absolute, the tragedy complete, and the regret eternal. And still he continues, because there is nothing else to do, because the alternative is to surrender to the emptiness and allow the mistake to compound itself. The Silent King moves through a galaxy that no longer remembers the Necrontyr, fighting to preserve life forms that will never know what was sacrificed so they could exist, carrying the weight of 60 million years of regret in a body that cannot weep, cannot scream, cannot do anything but endure. This is his punishment, and it will last forever, or until the stars themselves finally die and the universe goes cold and dark and silent. The Necrons awaken, tomb by tomb, dynasty by dynasty, and they do not remember what they have lost, who cannot comprehend the depth of what was taken from them. But Szarekh remembers, and in remembering, he bears the full weight of their collective tragedy, alone in his understanding, forever and always the silent king.